So U.S. President Donald Trump has threatened major strikes on Iran's energy infrastructure and bridges, and once again extended the deadline for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz to Tuesday, 8 p.m. U.S. local time. For more on this, we're joined today by Dr. Lee Ji-soo, visiting researcher at the Institute of Middle East Studies. Dr. Lee, thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for inviting me.
So President Trump has extended the deadline by another 24 hours, right, until Tuesday. What's behind the strategy?
I think this is a very deliberate and calculated move by Trump. On the surface, it looks like he's simply giving Iran more time, but in reality, it's part of a broader pressure strategy. By extending the deadline by just 24 hours, he's maintaining a very tight sense of urgency. He's basically saying, you still have a chance, but time is almost up. And that kind of short extension is designed to keep Iran under constant pressure without giving them enough time to regroup or delay. At the same time, this also reflects the fact that negotiations are not completely dead. There are still indirect talks happening, and Trump himself has suggested there's a good chance a deal could be reached. So extending the deadline gives space for those last-minute negotiations to continue. Another important point is that this fits a broader pattern. Trump has already extended deadlines multiple times during this crisis, so this isn't a one-off decision. It's part of a negotiating style where he keeps moving the deadline while increasing pressure. And we also have to consider the military angle. The U.S. has been openly threatening strikes on Iran's infrastructure if no deal is reached. By adding more time, Washington can continue preparing its options, whether that's military escalation or a diplomatic breakthrough. So overall, I'd say this is a classic Trump strategy. Maximize pressure, keep the threats credible, but leave just enough room for a last-minute deal.
I see. So Trump is maximizing his pressure, but Iran does not appear to be backing down. The country's parliamentary speaker actually dismissed Trump's recent threats of targeting its infrastructure as reckless and said Iran will target all infrastructure used by the U.S. military in the region. What's your take on this latest development?
I think this shows that Iran is not feeling concerned. Actually, it's quite the opposite. They're trying to show strengths. When Iran's parliamentary speaker calls Trump's threats reckless and warns of targeting U.S. infrastructure in the region, that's a very deliberate message. It's not just rhetoric. It is meant to signal deterrence. In other words, Iran is saying, if you escalate, we'll escalate as well. And they're expanding the scope beyond Iran itself, warning that U.S. assets across the region, especially in Gulf countries, could become targets. What's important here is that this kind of response makes the escalation much harder. Both sides are now raising the stakes, and neither wants to appear weak. Also, from Iran's perspective, backing down under direct threats, especially public ones, would be very costly in terms of domestic politics. So even if they're open to negotiations behind the scenes, publicly they have to take a hard line. So overall, I'd say this is a dangerous moment. It's becoming a cycle of threat and counter-threat, and the risk is that it could spiral into a broader regional conflict if neither side steps back.
And over the weekend, the United States said it rescued a missing crew member from a downed military plane in Iran. And Iranian forces had also been looking for the service member as well. Why was it so important for both sides to find this person?
This was extremely important for both sides, but for very different reasons. For the U.S., recalling that crew member as a top priority, which is almost non-negotiable, U.S. has a long-standing military principle. You don't leave your people behind. That's about moral credibility and also preventing sensitive information from falling into enemy hands. But there is also a historical memory here. The U.S. is still very conscious of the 1979 Iran hostage crisis, when American diplomats were held in Iran for over a year. That experience left a deep mark on U.S. policy, so any situation where an American could be captured in Iran is taken extremely seriously. On the other hand, for Iran, capturing that service member would have been a major strategic and symbolic win. It could be used for intelligence, leverage in negotiations, or even propaganda. So essentially, both sides were racing against each other, the U.S. trying to rescue and Iran trying to capture. That's what made this situation so dangerous. It wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a high-stake race shaped not only by the current conflict, but also by decades of historical mistrust.
Right, absolutely. And U.S. military fighter jets being shot down in Iran. This raised questions over the Trump administration's claims that U.S. forces had already obtained air superiority over Iran. What's your take on this?
I think this incident definitely raises questions, but it doesn't necessarily mean the U.S. has lost airspareity. Airspareity doesn't mean zero losses. It means you can operate more freely in the air than your opponent. In this case, I think the U.S. still has a clear technological and operational advantage overall. That said, the fact that Iran was able to shoot down multiple U.S. aircraft does suggest that its air defense capabilities are still very much intact. In fact, these incidents show that this is not an uncontested airspace. Iran still has mobile air defense systems, missiles, and drones that can pose real risk, especially in its own territory. So I would say this highlights the gap between political messaging and battlefield reality. The Trump administration has been emphasizing total control, but in practice, this looks more like partial or contested airspareity. And that's important because it means operations are riskier than advertised and the chances of escalation or miscalculation are higher. So overall, this doesn't overturn U.S. dominance, but it does challenge the narrative that the skies over Iran are fully under U.S. control.
I see. I guess we'll have to see how that goes. All right, Dr. Lee, thank you so much for your time and insight today. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.